about the tablecloth that came down from heaven.
Right, yeah.
You remember that one?
Yeah,
It's a very strange story that nobody understands, and I think I now understand what it is actually talking about. But Arthurian history has exactly the same, and of course it happens in Arthurian history where this tablecloth comes down from heaven. And it's the same person. It's this St. Peter character. It's this Percival character within Arthurian history. And what it was actually saying is that this was a Masonic meeting, because Jesus was a Mason. This is what carpenter means. Jesus was not a carpenter. In the Greek, he was a tecton. And if you look it up in Greek, a tecton is a Freemason. So Jesus was a Freemason of the Judean Lodge. He was the Master Mason. In fact, higher than that, he was the supreme head of the Masonic Church in Judea. And what this tablecloth business was all about was one of the early lodge meetings. If you remember in early lodge meetings when in Britain, when they didn't have dedicated temples for the lodge meeting, what they used to have was a tablecloth. And the tablecloth would be marked out with all of the accoutrements of masonry. So that the main tablecloth would be a black and white checkerboard, the same as it is in any Masonic lodge. And you would spread this out on the ground, and then you would put the 3 tablecloths, or napkins as they call them, which were the napkins of the 3 degrees of masonry, and they would be placed upon the tablecloth. And then everyone would gather round and you would have your Masonic meeting. And this is what St. Peter was doing with this tablecloth. It was a lodge meeting. And no doubt this tablecloth would be spread out on the floor, and it would have all sorts of astrological imagery written on it. It was a zodiac. It was probably actually, marked out with the signs of the zodiac.
Right.
And this is what they were talking about. But they were talking about it within Acts of the Apostles, and they are talking about it within Arthurian history, within history of the Holy Grail. And so now we come into the story of the galleys, and this is a very interesting aspect of both biblical history and also of Arthurian history, because the galleys were the eunuch priests of Cybele. And surprisingly enough, they are a central component within biblical history, because Jesus asked for his disciples to become eunuchs, to get castrated. There are some eunuchs that are born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Matthew 19:11. What Jesus is asking here is any of his disciples who can receive castration to be castrated and become eunuchs. Why? Because the eunuchs were the galley high priests of Cybele. And this is what he was asking his disciples to do. And this is why Jesus himself is called a Galilean. And also St. Peter is as well. Yeah, St. Peter is called a Galilean in Luke 23:26. The Galileans were not from Galilee, which is what they want you to think. The Galileans were the galley high priests. They were the eunuchs. And this is why Jesus was asking his disciples to become eunuchs, because they were the Galileans.
And that would be because the consort of Cybele was it Attis and then Mithras? I mean, there's a whole Mithras tie-in there, isn't there?
Yep, absolutely. Because of Attis. Attis was the eunuch son, partner of Cybele. And so they were, as the high priests, they were following in the footsteps of Attis. And this is what it was talking about in Arthurian history when we have a person called Galahad who becomes the king of the galley. the galleys. It wasn't talking about Wales. It was talking about him becoming the king of the galley. Percival takes his sword and he thrusts it between his thighs to become a eunuch. And one of the central titles within Arthurian history is the Wounded King. And the Wounded King is wounded between the thighs. He is a eunuch. He is a galley high priest. On these days, the galley are made. These are the eunuchs, of course. While the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and he rushes into the center with a great shout and takes up his sword and immediately castrates himself. And then the galley rushes through the city holding his testicles, and he takes women's clothes and adornments from whichever house he throws the testicles into. And Josephus Flavius gives us a complete description of these galley high priests. And he calls them Galileans. He doesn't call them galley, he calls them Galileans, which of course is the title for Jesus and St. Peter, who were both called Galileans. Anyway, I shall quote again, because this is quite an interesting little quote. This is Josephus Flavius talking about the Galileans in the 1st century, and these were the people who were involved in the Jewish revolt. In fact, they were central key players within the Jewish revolt. And he says, the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments and were smeared with ointments that they might appear very comely. And they had paint on their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments, but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands. And while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and drew their swords from under their finely dyed cloaks, and ran people through with their swords. So, the eunuch Galahad was also a warrior. He might have been dressed in a woman's red dress. He might have worn makeup and lipstick and eyeshadow and wiggled his hips like a wanton woman, as Josephus says. But he also had a sword under his cloak, and he took out his sword and he killed his enemies. So, yes, Galahad was still a knight. Not necessarily in shining armor. He was a knight in a red dress, but he was still a knight of the realm. And this might be a bit shocking for Arthurian history, but what I'm doing here is just following the evidence without fear or favor, just following the evidence wherever it takes. And the evidence takes us back into 1st century Judea, where this was the reality of the Jewish revolt. But this ended up as a British story. So how did we get to Britain? Well, we've already spoken about one reason why it ended up in Britain. But there is another reason it ended up in Britain, and that's because the Jewish revolt failed. And it was Rome that won this particular revolt. And so the leaders of the revolt were crucified, taken down from the cross, and one of them survived. And all of them were taken as captives to Rome. But what was Rome going to do with these particular captives? I mean, these were dangerous rebels from the east of the empire who had started a Jewish revolt against Rome. What Rome wanted was to quell all of these ideas of revolt in the Eastern Empire. So what Rome wanted to do was to stop this militancy from militant Judaism, which is why they sent Joseph of Arimathea to Sarras to take the surrender and to change their religion. But the survivors of the Jewish revolt were taken into captivity, and they were eventually taken to Britain, to Chester. where Rome went and built what you might call a sort of first century Guantanamo Bay, basically. And it was Fortress Diwa, which was in modern Chester. And that was a prison fortress, and that is where they ended up. So this story does move naturally from Judea to first century Britain, because that was as far as you could get from Judea within the first century, within the Roman Empire. If you look at the opposite end of the empire from Judea, the opposite end ends up in Britain. And the frontier of Britain at that particular time, we're talking AD 70 here, was Chester in Britain. And that's where they built this fortress. Is also was built. This was in Fortress Diwa, where we find this Temple of the Zodiac, I suppose you could call it, was built in this particular fortress. So yes, this was a central component of their theology and their history, was all to do with this processional zodiac. And these eunuchs were part of it, because there is another good zodiac on the Sea of Galilee as well, which is the Hamat-Taveria zodiac. And that's a very interesting zodiac, because that is processional, it's first century, and it shows the central character, who is the Arthurian character. So we have the central character within a zodiac can either be the sun, Helios, or Ursa Major. And Ursa Major is, of course, the Great Bear. And this is where the name of Arthur came from. This is why Arthur is the central character. This is why Arthur is surrounded by 12 knights of the Round Table, because the Round Table was a zodiac. It's not a table at all, it's a zodiac. Well, it might have been a real table. They might have all sat round it, a little bit like the Round Table in Winchester. But it would have...
Just to throw in one small point, and again, I may be wrong etymologically, but the word Camelot, the C-A-M aspect, can be like a camshaft, something that revolves. So the very word Camelot has within it, even loosely, the idea of a rotating, something that rotates. And if you get into the etymology of a lot of the Arthurian stuff, like Tintagel and all of these places, there's a lot of this rotating symbolism actually comes up. Can't get into it now, but Camelot is a word that almost has the camshaft, the idea of a rotating, which is very central to Celtic mythology, referring, as you say, to the heavens.
Absolutely, and Emperor Nero had exactly the same. He had a rotating dining room, which was drawn with the symbols of the heavens on it. So he had a rotating dining room, no less, not just a table. So, yeah, the Arthurian character is the Ursa Major figure. That's what King Arthur means. King Arthur means the Great Arthur, or the Great Bear. The Great Bear is Ursa Major. It's the same name. That's why he had 12 disciples, 12 knights around his round table. That's why Jesus had 12 disciples around his table, because Arthur was Jesus. So Jesus had a round Last Supper table surrounded by 12 disciples or knights. It's the same symbolism. And it was all based upon the zodiac. And
it's interesting, too. I just kind of thought of this. There was a mention, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was stated in the New Testament by Jesus, talking about, I'm here to bring the sword. And
yes.
And it's a lot of people thought, it meant the sword of truth and all of that. But then that also ties into the idea of Excalibur and what King Arthur was, that whole legend of King Arthur. When you really compare the two, it sounds quite similar in a way.
Oh, it is. And it's also a reference to the Jewish revolt, of course, because he was a warrior monarch. He was a warrior king. And so when Jesus says, I did not come to bring peace to the world, I came to bring a sword.
Right, yeah.
And then he goes on to the little apocalypse, as they say it, where he says he's going to bring civil war, basically, to Judea. it's part and parcel of this Jewish revolt idea, where he was actually a warrior monarch, not a pauper prince of peace. And the best one, I do have a quote here somewhere, is I think it's Luke 19:27, where he says, "Bring my enemies before me who would not acknowledge me as their king, and kill them in front of me." Luke 19:27.
Sounds like a Prince of Peace to me.
Yeah, precisely. It's not the sort of thing you'll get from the pulpit.
Right.
But this is part and parcel of what the actual story was about. He was a warrior monarch. He was making a bid for the throne of Rome, as well as the king of Judea. This is what Arthur was doing as well, because remember, this is the big problem with Arthurian history. Why he cannot exist in the Dark Ages was because the central theme within Arthurian history is that King Arthur wanted to become the Emperor of Rome. So he has a tax dispute with Rome, and he wants to become the King of Rome, the Emperor. Now, this could not have happened within the Dark Ages when they set this story, because they set this story in the late 5th century, early 6th century. Quite often it's about 530 or so AD. There was no Rome in 530. It had ended. It had gone. It has disappeared. It was an ex-Rome. It had fallen off its perch. Rome ended in 480 AD. So all of these Arthurian histories that say Arthur had a tax dispute with Rome, and that's one of the central elements of all of these Arthurian manuscripts, cannot be correct, because there was no Rome to have a dispute with. It did not exist. So how can we explain this story? Well, because it was actually a 1st century story. We have this great chronological chasm, a 500-year chasm. And these events actually happened in the 1st century. And they were called Galileans. This is why, as we were saying before, that Galahad received this title, because he was a Galilean. And he wore a dress, just as you were saying. Yeah, it was you who were saying that the priesthood have the same traditions now. And I'm sure you'll bring up an image of this. I'll send you some images later.
Absolutely. And same kind of rituals as well, with the whole abstinence and this sort of hatred for the sexual parts of the whole aspect of that. It's all just a reflection of these ancient cults, right? Yes.
Instead of being eunuchs, they try to be chaste, of course, and that's why Catholic priests are not allowed to marry, and that's why Catholic priests wear a dress, a red dress, and I'll send you some pictures later, obviously. But if you just imagine a cardinal on his procession through the cathedral, you will know exactly the sort of thing that Sir Galahad would have been wearing. He would have been wearing exactly the same uniform, and it happens to be a red dress. And you might be thinking, hold on, Sir Galahad was a brave knight in shining armor with his magical sword, who was cutting his enemies down left, right, and center. How does this equate with this effeminate new Galahad that is coming out of this new research? That he was a eunuch priest of Cybele. It dovetails exactly, and we have this history again courtesy of Josephus Flavius. So the Grail is a stone. So the very essence of the Holy Grail is a sacred stone. And this is not an Arthurian stone, of course. This comes, as you say, from prehistory. This is the Benben stone of Egypt. And the Benben stone of Egypt was always identified with the phoenix. And interestingly enough, Eschenbach says that the Grail stone, because he describes it as a stone, was brought to Earth by aliens. And that's how he describes them. He's not even describing them as being angels as such. He's describing them as being aliens. And the aliens gave this stone. It's a conical stone. It's not very big. You could probably imagine it being about 80 centimeters high. What's that? 2.5 foot high. Conical in nature, maybe about 2 foot across at the base. And there may have been more than one of these. There may have been 2 stones, not 1 stone. Anyway, this stone was brought to Earth, and it was given to a special family to look after, a royal family. And so within Arthurian history, you have these many allusions to a grail, which are diversionary. They are hidden meanings for the grail, because no one could really talk about this grail stone directly. So the common one we get, of course, is the grail, a dish. But that was born out of the sangreal wordplay, which is a very old wordplay. You know, some people say, oh, this was only born in that very famous book, what was it, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, by Bagent and Lee, where they highlight this wordplay. But this wordplay actually goes back into medieval history, so it's a very old wordplay between the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which is a holy dish, and the blood royal, the sang royal, being a very simple wordplay in the French. So the dish is a bloodline. And when you go through Arthurian history, especially through the Vulgate cycle, the Grail is always identified with a princess. And so all the way along, it's trying to allude to the Grail being a princess. So every time the knights see the Grail, all they see is a princess holding a dish. And nobody can quite understand what this Grail is. What is this dish? What is so special about the dish? And of course, the Grail is not the dish at all. The Grail is the person holding the dish. So the Grail is the princess. And that's why the knights cannot see the Grail, because they're looking at the wrong thing. As I describe in my book, it's like children looking for Father Christmas when their parents are standing in front of them. And they still can't see Father Christmas. And so this is...
So then it's the womb figure. The child can't see the womb in which it's born.
Absolutely. So this is the illusion they are made to. So that these are the 2 or 3 aspects of the Grail. The Grail was a sacred stone, but the Grail was given to a bloodline to look after, and the bloodline is the Grail princess. So the Grail has a princess who looks after it, tends to its needs. But the princess can't guard a Grail. And so the Grail must also have a Grail knight to look after it. And the Grail knight is the Galahad, the head galley, the galley high priest. And the knight who looks after the Grail must be a eunuch, which is why the Grail keeper is always described within the Vulgate cycle as being the wounded king, who is also the Fisher King. Why is he the wounded king? Because he's been castrated. So he is the eunuch. He is the Galahad. And so these are the 3-4 aspects of the Grail. And we have the 2 together again. We have the galley high priests and the stone in 1st century biblical history. And we have the galley high priest, Elagabalus, and the stone within Roman history in the 3rd century AD. And we know this is a New Testament story because, as we saw, Jesus asked for his disciples to become eunuchs. And the high priest of Christianity was Simon. And his surname, his title, was the Peter. Simon Peter, or Saint Peter as he's often known. And Peter, of course, means the stone. So his name was not Peter, his name was Simon, and he was called Simon the Stone. Why? Because he looked after the sacred stone. He was the Kephas, he was the Peter. He looked after the sacred stone, and he was a eunuch. So St. Peter was a eunuch. And we even have a description of the ceremony where he became a eunuch, which was that ceremony you get on the just outside Judea, outside Jerusalem, on the Mount of Olives. If you remember, Jesus was on the Mount of Olives, and the Romans came to get Jesus, and Simon Peter cut off the ear of one of the Romans. And just after that, a young man escapes naked from this meeting on the Mount of Olives. Why was there a naked young man at this meeting where the Romans arrived? Well, he was the new Galley. This was an initiation ceremony for the Galley high priests. And within Arthurian history, the new Galley high priest, the new eunuch, was actually Percival, who became the Galahad. And we have this wonderful description of Sir Percival thrusting his sword into his loins in order to become a eunuch. And for many, many reasons, it's pretty obvious that St. Peter was Sir Percival.
When you were talking about the Grail being the sacred stone, and that it was really originally guarded by a princess, which then was guarded by a knight, and the princess was symbolizing the bloodline, right? Something popped into my head, which was actually Michael had done the work on the Queen's coronation, and of course in the Queen's coronation there's the stone of scone that is there, and so you've got the princess turning into a queen that's using this stone symbolism, the sacred stone, and of course now she's residing and protecting the stone, representing it, right, in a very symbolic way. And then speaking of sacred stones, you also have the black stone, the Kaaba stone in Mecca, and they believe in and of course we're talking about that region of the world, the East, and they have the idea that it fell from Jannah, which would be like the garden, or from heaven, right? And it was supposed to show Adam and Eve where to build an altar, and again it became the first temple on earth. So you've got these sacred stone motifs throughout these religions, and then also symbolized in royal coronations and whatnot. And it just so interesting that it all falls into place through the Arthurian legend, as you're saying.
And in the coronation, she's given 2 rings, sapphire and ruby, colors that Ralph has explained in previous books going back to Egypt and the cult of Set, remember?
Yeah, yep.
And Georges, the St. George. I mean, we're not going to get into that, but the stone that a king would wear on his finger is a metaphor or euphemism, just like the lingam stone or stone of Phal, as you're saying, David. The mound, I would say even the Mount of Olives or the Sermon on the Mount, all of these conical type things. We dealt with this in the Female Illuminati actually extensively, that conical shape.
Right.
Leonardo da Vinci has a painting of a small altar where Mary, apparently the Virgin Mary, is overlooking there's an angel on one side, I think, Mary on the other, and in the middle there's a conical stone. So this thing is definitely a protectorate of the goddess. But even the stones that one would wear as a king on their finger probably relate as a euphemism to this stone that you're talking about, the conical stone on your finger of kingship and connection to the heavens.
And where they were placed as well, because all of these stones were actually situated upon conical hills. I think myself the original conical hill was the Great Pyramid, but within Judean type history, this stone was located at Tekoa, which is Herodium, which is the conical hill south of Jerusalem. If anyone's been there, it's quite a wonderful place. Herod built a castle on the top of it, but you've got this strangely shaped conical hill south of Jerusalem. In Edessa, it was put on the hill at Sogmata, and that was a conical hill exactly the same. In Emesa, they have another conical hill, which happens to be a volcano with a castle on the top of it, which is just outside Homs. I've got a picture of that in the book as well. And where do we get? Oh, we've got another one, of course, at Silbury, which is the strangely enough, the hill at Sogmatar in Syria is exactly the same dimensions and shape as the hill at Silbury. But there we go. That's another strange coincidence.
Just look how important these hills and mounds were in Celtic mythology. I mean, they've sort of been considered goddess symbols as well, but they're not just in the West. They're all over the place, as you say. But this is a tremendous way to decode that symbol, which turns up, I mean, in so many places. It's not even funny. Right from the Mount Sinai symbolism, or Mount Horeb. I mean, it's Mount Ararat. I mean, just think of the symbols of the mount that through the mythologies of the world.
And then Arthur himself having to pull Excalibur out of the stone, right? Or the Lady of the Lake, right? Or then it was the sword and the stone. I'm trying to remember how the order went.
Yeah,
that element was there as well.
Strangely enough, Excalibur doesn't take a very big part of Arthurian history. It's not mentioned. Yeah, it's not mentioned very often at all. So it's really not a part of my book because it's not really a central component. They have this wonderful, strange addition to it where the sword is actually stuck in a princess instead of a stone. So the princess and the stone are being linked again because the sword gets stuck in a princess as well as being stuck in a stone.
Well, and as previously mentioned, the sword was decapitating the man stones to make them the eunuchs, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was doing that as well. And the Grail.
I was going to say it connects to this act of castration, which is at once a symbol of self-mastery, but self-initiating yourself to a higher level of the order, shall we say, right, or the rights, and that's coming from the gynocratic period, but it's the man linking himself as an agent. And then you see, remember we were looking at earlier the idea of whether it was a dragon or a fish. In one way, the Pendragon can still be a dragon, though, after what you're saying, if one accepts that that the Grail is really a bloodline. Symbolized by the object. The object is, in the end of the day, not really that important. It's just a metaphor for the actual bloodline. Then, in one way, dragon does work because it's the bloodline. It's the dragon court. In fact, even one of the original etymologies, they thought it may be actually wrong, but the Grail itself, that word comes from either kratis, which meant a woven basket, or gradus, which we get our word grades. The grades or degrees or stages of. So again, you're perfectly right. If the etymology of Grail comes from gradus, then it is about the gradual unfolding of something, the gradual stages, steps along the way, which can mean either Masonic type degrees, some other kind of astrological series of rites, or you often see in medieval art, Mary is on steps leading up to the temple. She's often seen standing on the 5th or 7th step. You'll see these steps, so there's definitely the female in regard, some sort of unfolding, and the Grail etymology possibly also ties into that.
Yeah, except I would have to differ with you on one point there, in that Arthurian history is quite certain that the stone came first and the bloodline came second. So the important aspect was the delivery of the stone from aliens, as it says, to the bloodline. So the stone is the most important aspect of this. And the stone was given to the bloodline to look after. So the bloodline came second, the stone came first. So the most sacred item, is the stone. And the Grail Keeper has to be a eunuch, presumably because of the people who gave the stone were eunuchs. I can't trace it any further back than Egyptian history, because we don't know who gave the stone in the first place. But this castrated eunuch business, to me, appears to come from Akhenaten, So we're going back into Egyptian history and Pharaoh Akhenaten again, because the Galileans worshipped the primeval Adam, was their prime god, was the primeval Adam. And the primeval Adam is an Atum type character, the god Atum from Egypt, who was, a solitary god, who was not exactly a eunuch, but he was certainly a sort of, not a hermaphrodite. Anyway, he had to embody the male and the female because he was just one god on his own. And what happened in some respects is that Pharaoh Akhenaten tried to imitate and model himself upon the Atum type character, the primeval Adam. And so if you look at any of the statuary and sculptures of Akhenaten, he is always portrayed as a eunuch. Well, no, not even a eunuch. He is a what's the word I'm looking for?
Like a hermaphrodite.
Not a hermaphrodite, because they have both sexual organs, but something that is not asexual completely, has no sexual organs at all. Anyway, he's portrayed in that fashion. So just like Emperor Elagabalus tried to neuter himself completely, and the Gali high priests tried to neuter themselves completely, so Akhenaten did exactly the same. And of course, in one of my early books, Eden in Egypt, I identify the biblical Adam with Akhenaten. So Adam and Eve were actually Akhenaten and Nefertiti.
I think that book is also monumental. I've read that book. It was one of my favorites. It's absolutely extrapolates some of the more difficult, aspects of the Akhenaten reign are completely made transparent in that book. So it's really fantastic, and it's also tied deeply into the Old Testament Genesis story. Yeah,
it sort of makes sense of the Old Testament story, which never made sense before whatsoever, and suddenly it starts to make sense. But it also brings Akhenaten in as a central component at the foundation of Israelite Judean history, as being the archetypal Adam, the primeval Adam, the first man, the proanthropos, as they call it, the first man. And so he was the original eunuch. And if you're having a priesthood that maintain this tradition, the Gali priesthood, they would have to imitate Pharaoh Akhenaten. And if they're going to imitate Akhenaten, they're going to have to be, at the very least, castrated. And this, I think, is one of the original foundations where this particular tradition came from. And so it came out of Egypt.
Sorry to interject again, but at Chartres Cathedral, the Grail is seen in the hands of the famous effigy of Melchizedek.
Oh, yes, the high priest.
Yeah, so on the statuary, and we know that Chartres was not only a goddess center, but it was Masonically built. How come they're showing Melchizedek? And in my work, Melchizedek is Akhenaten. It's just a euphemism, like Moses was, what you had brought to the fore. Moses and Akhenaten are identified, if not exactly the same person, then certainly very closely identified. And in my work, Melchizedek is the Masonic rendition of Akhenaten. And there you have it in Chartres Cathedral. He's actually holding the grail.
That could well be, actually. I've never thought of it in that fashion. That could well be, actually. That would fit very well, because Jesus was supposed to be the follower from Melchizedek.
Yeah, and remember at the Queen's coronation, it's Handel's Zadok, which is a short, the priests of Zadok are the Gali. From the ancient times, the priests of Zadok would probably fit that. I mean, we have to look into it, but it's the same cult as far as I'm concerned, an Egyptoid cult. And curiously, in the coronation of the Queen, it's Handel's Zadok King that's being sung. So it's just incredible how this happened.
Because the brother of Jesus was James, and James was the Zadok.
Right.
James is called,
James
is called James the Just. And this is the trouble when you get so many languages all together. This is why it's very difficult to follow these names. But Justus, in the English, if you translate it into Aramaic, is Zadok.
Oh,
So
wow.
he was called James Zadok. That was his official title. So he was a Zadok. So yes, we come back to the same story that
But then they're
all of
keepers of the Grail. That family, then, as you're saying, that's confirmation. Right there in Chartres Cathedral in stone.
Yes.
It's the Melchizedek characters holding the Grail.